An 18-year-old white male has been arrested and charged with first-degree murder for a mass shooting at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, in what authorities called an act of racially motivated violent extremism. Authorities say at least 10 people have been reported dead from the shooting, which took place in a predominantly black neighborhood in Buffalo on Saturday afternoon. Buffalo Police Commissioner Joseph Gramaglia said the suspect was armed with an assault-style rifle and body armor when he opened fire in the parking lot while live-streaming the attack on Twitch.
He worked his way back towards the front of the store. Buffalo police immediately respond, engage the suspect in the vestibule of the store, and at that point the suspect put the gun to his own neck. Buffalo police personnel, 2 patrol officers, talked the suspect into dropping the gun. He dropped the gun, took off some of his tactical gear, surrendered at that point.
Officials said 11 of the 13 people struck by gunfire were black, and that the attack would be investigated both as a hate crime and an act of racially motivated violent extremism under federal law. Twitch said in a statement that it removed the live stream of the attack less than 2 minutes after it started and was working to ensure no other accounts reposted the content. Speaking at the suspect's arraignment on Saturday, New York Governor Kathy Hochul said such live streams were responsible for a feeding frenzy of violent extremist ideology. She also pledged to introduce previously planned gun control legislation on Tuesday to address loopholes in state laws.
To see that sense of security shattered by an individual, a white supremacist who has engaged in an act of terrorism and will be prosecuted as such, it strikes us in our very hearts to know that there's such evil that lurks out there.
Documents attributed to the suspect have been circulating online, including a to-do list for the attack, as well as a 180-page manifesto alleging that minorities are replacing white people worldwide.
And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
One of the main reasons was because it was a white community.
And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
This was Levittown, Pennsylvania, shortly after World War II, in a suburb that explicitly promised a white-only neighborhood. And it wasn't some outlier. It was the prototypical suburb, built by the father of suburbia, Bill Levitt, who created several suburbs around the US, all named Levittown. But one reason Levitt wanted a white-only community was because the US government was subsidizing it, and that's what they wanted. They said they didn't want racially inharmonious groups, lowering property values. That's why Levitt didn't just sell cookie-cutter houses. He sold a meticulously crafted, affordable, utopian lifestyle. So as the courts integrated public spaces like schools, more and more white people fled to these suburbs. And these patterns are still the defining characteristic of America's racial geography. But we now spend most of our time at work, and there, it gets a lot more complicated.
More than 1 million persons each year have pulled up stakes in the cities and turned commuters.
Shortly after the first Levittown broke ground in 1947 in Long Island, New York, about 80% of men still commuted the hour to Manhattan. And while neighborhoods were getting deeply segregated, these workplaces were getting more diverse. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned employment discrimination. More companies explicitly said that they were equal opportunity employers, and segregation within our workplaces declined. This meant the workplace was a crucial environment for us to interact with people of other races. Except that's not exactly how it turned out. A few months ago, researchers at Cornell and Penn State shared a dataset with me, and when I mapped it, it kind of blew my mind. This is a map of where people work in modern-day Chicago. The taller an area, the more people there are. But But now let's color in each neighborhood by the percentage of white people. You can see the city centers are pretty diverse. But now, here's what happens when they go home. What's even more astounding is what happens when we map people of color. Here's where black people work in Chicago. Again, they're concentrated in diverse city centers. But when black workers go home, they go to very segregated neighborhoods, clustered in poorer areas. And we can see the same patterns in DC, Detroit, Philadelphia, pretty much everywhere in the US. These maps show just how stubborn residential segregation is. But they also show what looks like a glimmer of hope for integration. Cities are remarkably diverse during the workday. So this got researchers interested in looking closer at what's at work. Let's look at how segregation changed in recent years. From 2000 to 2010, residential segregation between black and white people got slightly better. For the most part, segregation just mostly plateaued for all racial groups. But when researchers looked at how segregation changed during the day when we're at work, they found that segregation increased slightly across all racial groups. When we zoom in some more to the company level, we can see a bit more of what's actually happening. Researchers at Stanford and Harvard found within a company, segregation levels have gone down very little. In other words, we're exposed to about as much diversity now as we were a generation ago. But there are a lot more people of color now than there were in 1980. So what's going on? Well, they aren't being more represented at these white majority companies, which would look like this. Rather, they're getting opportunities at companies that are mostly non-white, over here. So this means that when we look at this from a company level, segregation has actually gotten worse than a generation ago. Of course, some places are pretty diverse. So researchers looked at what kinds of places actually have less segregation during the day. But they found that if a place is diverse during the day, it's likely not because people of all races are working alongside each other. Rather, it's probably because most of the higher status workers, like managers, are white, and the lower status workers, like janitors, are people of color. American policies engineered our segregated homes. But work, where we spend most of our time, many thought that could be a space where we form meaningful relationships with people of other racial backgrounds. That hasn't quite happened, and we see it in the most personal parts of our lives. In 2014, the Public Religion Research Institute asked Americans to list the people with whom they've discussed important matters in the past 6 months. In other words, our friends. Most Hispanic people had friends of other races. About 1 in 3 black people did too. But 75% of white people only had white friends. In short, we may be exposed to diverse spaces, but we still live very segregated lives.
But the whole trouble with this integration business is that in the end, it probably will end up with mixing socially. And
Replacement theory is the idea that white populations, both in North America, here in the USA, and in Europe, are being replaced by minority populations, largely through immigration.
replacement theory that he talked about in this manifesto. There are people who are pushing this hatred on these young people, indoctrinating their minds. We intend to hold those responsible for the root of the hate, the people who curate the hate, the people who inspire the hate on websites and internet services and cable news stations.
We all know that no child is born with hate. Hate is taught. We must pay attention to hate speech, what it can do, its capacity to completely destroy, its capacity to completely dehumanize. We need to understand that no society in the world is immune from hate speech. I've just come back from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and I spent a lot of time among the Rohingya people. Hate speech was employed to dehumanize the Rohingya, referring to them as subhuman, referring to them as fleas, referring to them as thorns that needed to be removed. And ultimately, that is precisely what happened. By the time they arrived in Bangladesh, they had gone through decades of torture, decades of displacement, decades of dehumanization. And this hate speech that has been employed is something that we must pay attention to. There's a lot of information on Bosnia-Herzegovina, on what happened in Srebrenica. The hate speech that preceded and accompanied the killing of the men and boys in Srebrenica. There's a lot of information on the Tutsi in Rwanda and the moderate Hutu, and the hate speech that was used to describe the Tutsi, how they were dehumanized. We need to look at what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. We need to see how much hate speech was employed, to the extent that propaganda really was just spewing out hate speech against the Jews, describing them in ways that were designed to make it possible for the ordinary person on the street to just get out and participate in either killing the Jews or reporting on them or getting rid of them. So my message really to everybody is that genocides happen within communities. Genocides happen to you and me. When a genocide unfolds, the people targeted are people who are ordinary, and we must keep paying specific attention to the narratives that we pass on from one generation to the other. They are narratives in which communities share the trauma they experienced, and they pass it on to their children. We all know that no child is born with hate, that hate is taught. And we know that the first step of socialization for a child is the family. The child begins to hear about hate from parents, from siblings. They begin to hear about stereotypes, about other ethnic communities, about other racial, religious communities, and they begin to understand that there is something called an other, that there is us and then there is the other. We then move to the schools, and then we keep being socialized, this time by the media, by religious organizations, by political issues that we see happening. At this point, the child is now probably getting into university, and they've begun to internalize hate. They have the stereotypes in place, they have the prejudices in place. Then what that means is that that adult who was a child born without hate becomes the person who continues the next circle of socialization. And ultimately, what happens is that when people begin to fight each other, especially at the local level, then we'll have a war on our hands, and we know how difficult it is to stop wars. So what that means is that we must find ways to keep interrupting that circle of socialization through education, through knowledge, through having friends from different ethnic, racial, religious communities. And what I've learned is that the same tools that are used to spread hate often turn out to be the best tools to counter hate speech. So, for example, the cell phone. It's become a tool that's almost indispensable to many people. And it's also become a tool in which hate speech is spread through social media. The same tool can be used to counter hate speech. Social media, it's still an extremely useful tool of engagement. We just need to know how to speak to the issues that people need addressed. We must have conversations with our children and tell them not to fear difference, and tell them that difference is a really good thing. It's the perspectives that each brings to the table are perspectives that you would never hear if you just stayed with people who look and speak like you.
Good morning.
All right, Wisdom, wise one that you are. Common Sense Media, something I look at all the time as a mom, reveals that more than 60% of all 14 to 22-year-olds are exposed to some sort of hate speech while they browse. Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen, as you know, we followed this live the whole time she testified in front of the UK Parliament yesterday, and even here on Capitol Hill weeks ago, saying that anger was the most profitable emotion for Facebook. The quote was, unquestionably, Facebook is making hate worse. Wow. So what do we do with our kids, especially our vulnerable teens? Where do we even start the conversation? I mean, I tell my kids no, and all that does is create tension, but I'm not giving in. Maybe you need to help me out here with a more softer approach.
Well, I think it's really important for us to understand that our youth are navigating a very different social environment than we grew up in, where social media is taking center stage in their lives. And we can't also forget that during the pandemic, many of our youth have been relying on these social spaces for connection, for an opportunity to establish relationships with folks. So we have to be empathetic to that. But to your point, we also have to be mindful of the kinds of social media that our children are digesting, because we know, as we are observing, that some of these algorithms are designed to deliver content to our youth that they search for often. So let's say our youth are searching for harmful images, or they're searching for self-injury on the farther side. They will then be continuously fed those same kinds of images. And that is where the detriment comes. So as parents, we have to be vigilant. We have to make sure that we are observing the changes in behavior that erupts in our children as they navigate these social spaces, keep our devices in common places in the home, make sure that we ask the questions, who are you connecting with? And also be sure to make it clear that when our children are in spaces and they face difficult conversations or they're being forced to do something they don't want to do, that they understand that they can hold those boundaries firm. Ultimately, this is village work, right? Social media platform owners have to step up to the plate and also make sure that they do their work to protect our children. And as parents, we have to be vigilant and remind our children that we're doing this because we care and we love them.
So true. And just real quickly, Wisdom, while I'm thinking about it, my kids always say, but Mom, everyone else has devices. I just want to fit in. I feel left out. I feel like the one that isn't able to connect because they're all doing it. And, I'm sticking to my beliefs, but it is hard for my kids to tell me I feel like an outcast. What would you say to them, Wisdom?
I would say, my mother would always say the important thing is to do in life is to blend out, not to blend in. And I know that our children don't often resonate with those messages or too present in the now to appreciate them. But I think we have to explain to our children that this is the time when even finding time and space for yourself is important. So stepping away from these devices isn't just about, me as a parent wanting to set a firm boundary. It's also about maintaining your own self-awareness, finding a time to be mindful and to be alone with oneself. And lifting that up is actually a sign of maturity and also is a sign that one is stepping into a new way of being. I think our children really want to blend in, and that's important to recognize, but we have to encourage them that being themselves is their most precious asset.
Amen. Lori, let's talk about algorithms and product designs used by social media giants. I mean, it can magnify the harm to our children. How do we intercept that?
Well, if they're aware of it, that's the first thing that we need to do. So a lot of times that when children start using social media, they really don't even understand how privacy works. A lot of times kids will say, oh, it's a private account, so don't worry, nobody can see me unless I allow them to. But what they don't understand is that privacy actually means control. And it's their right to control who sees something, who knows something, how much they see and how much they know. However, what the children don't understand, and a lot of adults don't understand this either, is that we actually give up the right to control who sees our information once we put it out there, right? So you are choosing, when you have a private account, to say, okay, I'm going to allow two groups to control what I am putting out there. I'm going to allow the company to control it because they see everything I do. And then I'm going to allow my friends and followers to control this information as well. They can re-disseminate it and do whatever they want with it. But what happens is they also forget about the control the company has as far as what is being presented to them. The algorithms will say, okay, well, this child rolled over this image for a few seconds, so therefore they must want to see other things that are just like this. And it will flood the feed. And when it does that, it starts to normalize these things for our kids. And our kids start to think, okay, well, if I'm seeing this over and over and over again, it must be true, it must be right. And rather than our children saying, well, this is just what my generation does, this is just what's normal, we really need to help them ask bigger, better questions. Just because it's normal, does it make it safe? Does it make it healthy? Does it make it right for you? And when we do that, we start to empower them to be able to say, okay, you know what I'm being presented with in this algorithm may not match what my values are. They may not match what my family's values are. So it's really starting to understand who's controlling what in this environment.
Lori Getz and Wisdom Powell, thank you so much. I appreciate you both, especially as a parent.
I would like to thank you all for being here. And to thank those of you who have shared your thoughts and feelings with the courts, either in writing or in open court here today. I am both immensely proud of and grateful for the way Buffalo has rejected the evil and hate that was inflicted on our community. It is a testament to the power of love and compassion to overcome evil and hate by turning pain into purpose. But it is just the beginning. We have a long way to go. This hateful act and other similar hateful acts across the country, motivated by white supremacy and replacement theory, are a reckoning for us as a nation. The ugly truth is that our nation was founded and built in part on white supremacy, starting with the treatment of Native Americans by the first European settlers, to the cruel, inhumane, economic engine, nation-building practice of slavery, to indentured servitude, to Jim Crow laws, to government policies creating segregated public housing with communities of color often placed in environmentally hazardous locations, to the manner in which expressways were built, dividing urban neighborhoods to create easy access to government-subsidized developments in the suburbs, with restricted covenants prohibiting the sale of suburban homes to African Americans, to redlining practices in communities of color, further devaluing those neighborhoods, to the GI Bill, a well-deserved financial boon to our servicemen, unless, of course, you were a serviceman of color, to the war on drugs and mass incarceration, disproportionately of men of color, to the school-to-prison pipeline, to inequities in education, employment opportunities, and compensation, to the existence of food deserts and inadequacies in healthcare. Our history is replete with both individual and systemic discriminatory practices, many of them still firmly in place today. In fact, it is these very policies and practices that contributed to and made this atrocity possible. The effects of these policies, some current and others decades and centuries old, created the segregation in our city and enabled this defendant to research and identify his target to maximize the impact of his evil intent. All of these policies and systems, either sponsored or tolerated by the government and implemented by individuals, were designed to destroy the very fabric of family life, opportunities for success, the creation of generational wealth, and even the mere existence of hope in communities of color. The harsh reality is that white supremacy has been an insidious cancer on our society and nation since its inception. And it undermines the notions of a meritocracy and the land of opportunity that we hold so dear. However, white supremacy is not inevitable or unstoppable. It has been carefully cultivated and nurtured by individuals and the government for centuries. This is the history that we have all inherited. It has been passed down from generation to generation. We must acknowledge that history. Mr. Gendron, please stand. There is no place for you or your ignorant, hateful, and evil ideologies in a civilized society. There can be no mercy for you, no understanding, no second chances. The damage you have caused is too great, and the people you have hurt are too valuable to this community. You will never see the light of day as a free man ever again. It is the judgment of this court for your conviction under the first count of the indictment, a domestic act of terrorism motivated by hate in the first degree, an A1 felony, that you be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.